On the evening of December 7, 1941, Winston Churchill was at Chequers, his country residence, when the telephone rang and shattered the quiet. Sir John Dill, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, was on the line with urgent news from Washington. Churchill had been in the bath and, still dripping, wrapped in a towel, he lifted the receiver to hear Dill report a Japanese aerial assault on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burning, airfields smashed, thousands of American lives lost. A blow of historic scale. Churchill later wrote that the news hit him with profound sympathy for the American people and outrage at Japan's treachery. He immediately grasped the violence of the attack. 8 American battleships sunk or damaged, over 2,400 dead, the Pacific Fleet crippled. To Churchill, it was a terrible shock to the civilized world, a strike delivered without warning, without declaration, and without any moral restraint. Dill, standing with Churchill in the hours that followed, shared his alarm, both men recognizing that any hope of a peaceful settlement with Japan had vanished completely. And yet, beneath the shock, Churchill felt something else rising. Relief, a deep, private, strategic relief. For 18 months since the fall of France in 1940, Britain had stood alone against Nazi Germany. Britain survived only through endurance, stubborn will, and the steady trickle of American aid through Lend-Lease. Churchill had begged, argued, and maneuvered for U.S. involvement, but the American public had held firmly to isolationism. Pearl Harbor changed everything in a single afternoon. As more confirmed reports poured in at Chequers, Churchill's thinking crystallized. The Japanese attack, catastrophic as it was, had made the one alliance he desperately needed, now inevitable. He later wrote, "Being with me at Chequers that Sunday evening, Dill shared my feelings of gloom about the shattering of our hopes of a peaceful settlement with Japan, but of intense relief at the fact that the United States, hitherto neutral, was now in the war with us." That night, Churchill telephoned President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt sounded strained, his nation wounded, his fleet burning, but Churchill sensed something different in the American president's voice. Determination. Roosevelt was committed to war, fully and without hesitation. Churchill wrote, "His mien had changed. He was a changed man, a leader transformed from cautious neutral to wartime commander by a single strike." On December 8th, Roosevelt delivered his now immortal Day of Infamy speech to Congress. Churchill listened as Roosevelt declared that the United States was at war with the Empire of Japan. The moment the vote passed, Churchill experienced what he called an epiphany, one of absolute certainty. "And now at this very moment, I knew that the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death, so we had won after all. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations would live." This was not optimism, it was calculation. Churchill understood the industrial force now coming to his aid. A nation of 130 million people, and by 1942, producing 40% of the world's armaments. No Axis power, nor all three combined, could survive that. Privately, he said to his doctor, Lord Moran, "Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder." In one stroke, Britain's isolation, its greatest vulnerability, was gone. The war that had seemed endless now looked winnable. That night, despite the global situation worsening, despite a world at war on 3 continents, Winston Churchill experienced something he had not felt in over a year: inner peace. He retired early, telling those around him, "I never slept as soundly as the night following Pearl Harbor, for I knew that the American race would now be entering the war, and it would never be the same." He called it the sleep of the saved and thankful, the sleep of a man who understood that the darkest chapter of Britain's isolation had ended, and the path to final victory had begun. The hours and days following the United States' entry into World War II marked one of the most decisive turning points of the 20th century. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, the United States formally entered the war. Churchill instantly understood that the conflict had transformed from a desperate struggle for Britain's survival into a truly global Allied war effort with unprecedented industrial and military might behind it, and he wasted no time in ensuring that British and American strategy would be unified from the very first moments of this new phase of the war. On December 12th, just 4 days after Roosevelt's Day of Infamy address, Churchill left London aboard a modified Consolidated Liberator bomber for a dangerous transatlantic journey. The normal maritime route was too risky. U-boats prowled the North Atlantic, sinking an average of 20 ships per week, so Churchill's route required a long, circuitous flight pattern. He flew first to Gibraltar, then to Malta, then across the Atlantic in multiple legs to avoid German interception. It was a grueling 10-day ordeal, with Churchill sleeping in narrow bunks, his staff taking turns monitoring radio transmissions for signs of danger. Churchill arrived in Washington on December 22nd. It was his first wartime visit to the United States and the beginning of an extended stay lasting into the first weeks of 1942. Roosevelt personally greeted him at the White House, where Churchill would reside for the duration of the trip, occupying the Rose Room on the second floor. Almost immediately, the two leaders began a series of high-level discussions that would shape the direction of the entire war. These talks became formalized as the Arcadia Conference, held from December 22, 1941 to January 14, 1942. The meetings were secret and intense, held inside the White House, the Pentagon, and temporary war offices, with both nations' top generals and strategists present. Representing the United States was General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Harold R. Stark, and Roosevelt's closest advisors. The British delegation was led by General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, accompanied by high-ranking naval and air commanders. One of the most important outcomes of the Arcadia Conference was the creation of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, CCS. This was no temporary liaison group. It became a permanent joint Allied command, headquartered in Washington, D.C., designed to coordinate global strategy, allocate resources, and oversee operations across all theaters. Never before in modern history had two sovereign nations merged their military planning to such an extent. It was a bold experiment and the foundation of the Allied victory. Another cornerstone agreement was the adoption of the Germany First strategy. Despite Japan's devastating blow at Pearl Harbor and intense public fury in the United States, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Hitler represented the primary threat to global civilization. They resolved that 70% of U.S. resources, troops, material, and industry would be directed toward defeating Nazi Germany before shifting to a full offensive in the Pacific. This decision was neither automatic nor unanimous. Many U.S. generals, including Douglas MacArthur, pushed for a stronger Pacific commitment. But Roosevelt and Churchill held firm. Germany would fall first. December 26th brought one of the most memorable moments of Churchill's visit. He addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress, standing at the same podium where Roosevelt had delivered the infamy speech just days earlier. Churchill's booming oratory electrified lawmakers. His most famous line, "What kind of a people do they think we are?" was a direct rebuke to the Axis belief that America lacked the discipline or resolve for a long war. The speech helped ignite U.S. morale and strengthen public support for accelerated mobilization. The impact was immediate. Lend-Lease shipments, already substantial, surged from $500 million per month to $1 billion by mid-1942. Factories across the United States began converting en masse to war production. Detroit, the symbol of American industrial power, shifted from automobiles to tanks and aircraft. By year's end, U.S. factories would deliver 11,000 aircraft and 4,000 tanks, many directly supporting British forces in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the skies over Europe. Diplomatically, Churchill and Roosevelt solidified the Allied coalition. On January 1, 1942, they unveiled the Declaration of the United Nations, signed by 26 nations. This document pledged mutual aid, no separate peace agreements, and a united front against the Axis. It was the seed from which the post-war United Nations organization would eventually grow. Meanwhile, military operations intensified. On December 11th, 3 days after the United States declared war on Japan, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, a strategic blunder Churchill and Roosevelt had privately anticipated. Mussolini echoed Germany's declaration hours later. Roosevelt immediately responded with reciprocal declarations, and American troop deployments began at once. By February 1942, over 100,000 U.S. troops had arrived in the United Kingdom, where British and American planners began discussing Operation Torch, the joint Allied invasion of North Africa. The conference also addressed the Soviet Union's desperate need for supplies. Churchill pushed for Arctic convoys to support Stalin's armies. The first major U.S. crude convoy, PQ-15, sailed in May 1942, suffering heavy losses from U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks, but delivering tanks, trucks, ammunition, and aircraft essential for the Soviet defense. Economically, Churchill and Roosevelt established the Munitions Assignments Board to coordinate U.S. and British requests for material. The board prioritized British needs through 1942, ensuring a steady flow of equipment despite America's rapid mobilization. Churchill's residency in the White House fostered an extraordinary partnership. The two leaders held nightly strategy talks, often stretching past midnight, where Roosevelt, usually in his wheelchair, and Churchill, often in a silk dressing gown with cigar in hand, debated global operations. Churchill also spent long hours with General Marshall, whose calm discipline impressed him deeply. Though tensions emerged over Pacific priorities and U.S. insistence on protecting General MacArthur's forces, the personal bond forged in these weeks became the backbone of the wartime special relationship. By January 1942, the newly formed Combined Chiefs of Staff issued their first directive, a feasibility study for a cross-channel invasion of France. While this invasion, eventually codenamed Overlord, would be postponed until 1944, the strategic groundwork was already in place. These frantic early weeks of Anglo-American cooperation did more than respond to Pearl Harbor. They rewired the Allied war effort. The coordination structures created at Arcadia, the Germany First strategy, the surge in Lend-Lease aid, the integration of military planning, and the diplomatic unity of 26 nations all emerged from the intense collaboration between Churchill and Roosevelt after America entered World War II. What began as crisis management quickly became the blueprint for Allied victory, enabling turning points like El Alamein, the North African campaign, and eventually D-Day. Churchill later wrote that the United States' entry into the war shortened the struggle by years. In those first weeks after Pearl Harbor, he and Roosevelt moved with historic speed, fusing two nations into a single war machine and ensuring that the Axis powers would face an enemy far stronger than they had ever imagined. While the Arcadia Conference defined the broad strategic partnership between Britain and the United States, the days that followed saw a series of rapid, highly specific joint decisions that would shape the early months of the Allied war effort. Many of these actions unfolded behind closed doors, inside the map room of the White House, in improvised Pentagon offices, and even in Roosevelt's private study, where Churchill and Roosevelt worked hour by hour through the practical challenges of merging two global militaries. One of the first priorities was securing maritime supply lines. German U-boats had intensified their attacks along the American coastline, beginning the campaign later known as the Second Happy Time. British officers, long accustomed to naval warfare in the Atlantic, immediately urged the U.S. Navy to adopt convoy systems. Roosevelt agreed, though American admirals were initially skeptical. Within days, British anti-submarine advisors began training American officers in the use of radar-equipped escort vessels, high-frequency direction-finding stations, and the naval intelligence system known as Ultra. This rapid infusion of British expertise dramatically improved the U.S. Navy's early war readiness and helped prevent catastrophic shipping losses during the winter of 1941-42. At the same time, Churchill pressed for action in the Western Desert. Rommel's Africa Corps had regained strength, and British supply lines stretched thin across the Mediterranean. Inside the White House map room, British officers laid out aerial reconnaissance photos over Roosevelt's desk, pointing to fuel shortages and gaps in reinforcements. Roosevelt approved emergency shipments of American Sherman tanks, P-40 pursuit aircraft, and long-range B-24 bombers to Egypt. Many of these weapons reached the front by March 1942, just in time to prevent several potential Axis breakthroughs. Churchill also used his time in Washington to push Roosevelt for increased support to China. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces were struggling against Japanese pressure in Burma and central China. Churchill argued that a strong China would tie down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops, easing pressure on British possessions in Southeast Asia. After several days of debate, Roosevelt agreed to expand airlift operations over the Hump, the treacherous Himalayan supply route. Plans were also laid for the construction of the Ledo Road, later known as the Stilwell Road, to link India and China by land. Although the road would take years to finish, the decision reflected the Allied commitment to a multi-front strategy. Inside the Pentagon, British and American air commanders were engaged in their own intense discussions. U.S. Army Air Forces leaders expressed interest in adopting British night bombing tactics, while the Royal Air Force sought access to America's rapidly expanding aircraft production. Churchill, fully aware that British factories alone could not produce enough heavy bombers for a sustained air offensive, pushed Roosevelt to prioritize British allocations. By early January, the Munitions Assignments Board had approved increased transfers of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators to the RAF. In return, British officers shared detailed analyses of the Blitz, offering American strategists valuable lessons on civil defense, incendiary bombing, and radar interception. One of the lesser-known but critical joint decisions involved the expansion of intelligence sharing. The British already possessed a vast cryptographic advantage through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park. During Churchill's Washington stay, he authorized the placement of a permanent British liaison team inside the U.S. Navy's Communication Security Section and the Army's Signal Intelligence Service. This arrangement allowed American cryptanalysts access to Enigma decrypts and laid the foundation for the future Brucer Agreement of 1943. It also accelerated American development of code-breaking machines, some of which were later integrated into the operations at Bletchley. Another major topic was logistics, specifically the movement of American forces into Britain. The United States had little experience transporting such large numbers of troops across the Atlantic. Churchill proposed using British liners already converted into fast troopships, including RMS Queen Mary and RMS Queen Elizabeth, both capable of outrunning U-boats. Roosevelt approved the plan, and by early January, British and American staff officers began coordinating embarkation schedules. These preparations would soon enable the massive build-up of American forces in the British Isles throughout 1942. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Churchill and Roosevelt discussed the political challenges facing their respective governments. Churchill briefed Roosevelt on the strain that rationing, bomb damage, and the fall of British Malaya placed on public morale. Roosevelt, for his part, expressed concern about isolationist pockets within the U.S. Congress, even after Pearl Harbor. The two leaders coordinated public messaging strategies. Churchill's speeches would emphasize shared democratic values, while Roosevelt's fireside chats would frame the conflict as a joint struggle for global stability. These efforts helped reinforce bipartisan support for the war and minimized political friction between the Allies. During Churchill's stay, the British also secured access to several key American ports and airfields. The U.S. agreed to expand facilities at Norfolk, Boston, and New York for handling British convoys, while new air routes were planned through Bermuda, Newfoundland, and Greenland. These logistics networks later proved vital for ferrying aircraft and supplies to Britain and North Africa. Tensions did arise. The most significant centered on the Pacific. American generals believed that immediate counterattacks were essential to stop further Japanese expansion. Churchill worried that overcommitment in the Pacific might weaken the European front. The two sides clashed particularly over the defense of the Philippines. Roosevelt insisted on reinforcing General MacArthur, while Churchill questioned the feasibility of holding the islands. After lengthy debates, both sides compromised. The U.S. would maintain limited reinforcements to the Philippines, but shift long-term focus toward Australia and India as forward bases. These talks laid the basis for the future Southwest Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters of war. As January 1942 approached, the combined chiefs of staff intensified planning for major operations. Beyond studying a cross-channel invasion, the CCS examined alternate strategies, including large-scale offensives in North Africa, expanded submarine warfare in the Atlantic, and strategic bombing campaigns targeting German industry. Churchill, still recovering from the exhausting flight and busy schedule, spent long nights reviewing reports with his military advisors in the Rose Room. Roosevelt frequently visited him, and their late-night strategy sessions often continued past dawn. By the time Churchill departed Washington in mid-January, the immediate post-Pearl Harbor chaos had transformed into a structured Allied war effort. The United States and Britain had coordinated their global strategies, integrated military command structures, expanded intelligence sharing, accelerated weapons production, secured shipping routes, and initiated the massive transatlantic movement of American troops. The frantic, exhausting work completed during Churchill's visit ensured that the Allies would face the Axis not as fragmented nations, but as a unified coalition capable of sustaining total war across continents. These frantic early weeks of Anglo-American cooperation did more than respond to Pearl Harbor. They rewired the Allied war effort. The coordination structures created at Arcadia, the Germany First strategy, the surge in Lend-Lease aid, the integration of military planning, and the diplomatic unity of 26 nations all emerged from the intense collaboration between Churchill and Roosevelt after America entered World War II. What began as crisis management quickly became the blueprint for Allied victory, enabling turning points like El Alamein, the North African campaign, and eventually D-Day. Churchill later wrote that the United States' entry into the war shortened the struggle by years. In those first weeks after Pearl Harbor, he and Roosevelt moved with historic speed, fusing two nations into a single war machine and ensuring that the Axis powers would face an enemy far stronger than they had ever imagined. Churchill's departure from Washington in mid-January 1942 did not mark the end of the whirlwind diplomatic mission. Instead, it was the beginning of a wider North American tour designed to reinforce the emerging alliance and ensure total coordination across the English-speaking world. Before returning to Britain, he traveled to Ottawa, where he addressed the Canadian Parliament on December 30th, 1941. The speech, delivered beneath towering stone arches while snow fell heavily outside, was one of his most defiant wartime declarations. Standing behind the lectern, he warned that the new global war would test every corner of the Commonwealth, but also vowed that the combined strength of free nations would overwhelm the Axis. His famous closing line, "Some chicken, some neck," delivered in response to German claims that Britain was nearly finished, drew thunderous applause and bolstered morale across Canada, whose troops were then fighting in Hong Kong and preparing for deployment to Europe. During his Canadian stop, Churchill met extensively with Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Their private discussions focused on the expansion of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which had already turned remote stretches of Canadian prairie into vast networks of airfields. Churchill pushed for increased pilot throughput, knowing that the coming bomber offensive against Germany would require tens of thousands of crewmen. King agreed, authorizing accelerated construction, even as heavy snows hampered progress, and expanding the training program's capacity to nearly 50,000 aircrew per year. By late January, Churchill boarded a transatlantic vessel, convoyed by destroyers and corvettes tasked with shielding him from prowling U-boats. The voyage was tense. German submarines had intensified attacks in the Western Atlantic, exploiting gaps in American coastal defense. Several merchant ships were sunk during the crossing, their flaming silhouettes visible on the horizon. Churchill spent long hours in the captain's chart room reviewing intercepted Enigma summaries transmitted by the Admiralty. The decrypts revealed that U-boat wolfpacks were shifting operations to the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, threatening vital oil supplies. From the rolling deck of the ship, Churchill drafted urgent directives for the Royal Navy to accelerate escort production and coordinate with the newly established U.S. Eastern Sea Frontier Command. He returned to Britain at a precarious moment. Japanese forces were advancing rapidly across Southeast Asia. Singapore, long considered the Gibraltar of the East, was under heavy bombardment. Burma's northern approaches were collapsing, exposing India to potential invasion. Churchill convened the War Cabinet within hours of landing, spreading Pacific maps across the polished table. Reports from General Arthur Percival confirmed that British defences in Malaya were nearly exhausted. Although the fall of Singapore on February 15th would soon follow, Churchill's focus turned to preventing a domino effect. He ordered reinforcement of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, a key naval hub in the Indian Ocean, and coordinated with Roosevelt to divert American carrier task forces toward the region. These measures later proved critical when the Japanese fleet struck Ceylon in April, narrowly missing the British Eastern Fleet. Meanwhile, the situation in the Middle East demanded constant attention. Rommel launched a surprise counter-offensive in January, pushing British lines back toward Gazala. Churchill, frustrated with the pace of British response, began pressing the chiefs of staff for leadership changes. Before leaving Washington, he had convinced Roosevelt to accelerate delivery of M3 Grant tanks and additional aircraft for the Western Desert. Now, those supplies were urgently needed. Convoys carrying American tanks skirted U-boat-infested waters, escorted by newly developed British escort carriers equipped with Swordfish torpedo aircraft, a critical innovation introduced only months earlier. Churchill monitored these shipments daily through the Admiralty, aware that their arrival could determine the next phase of the North African campaign. On the home front, Churchill found Britain bracing for the hardest year of the war. German night raids remained sporadic but destructive. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, built up during 1941, was preparing larger strikes into the Ruhr. Churchill visited airfields at dusk, speaking with crews who climbed into Hampton and Wellington bombers under dim blackout lights. Many were barely in their 20s. He was briefed on new navigation aids, namely the G hyperbolic radio system, which would dramatically improve bombing accuracy. He pushed for rapid adoption, telling Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Pearse that technological advantage must offset limited resources. In early February, the combined chiefs of staff operating from Washington issued their first major integrated directive. All Allied planning was to assume a long war in Europe, prioritizing the defeat of Germany while conducting holding operations in the Pacific. Churchill reviewed the directive from the cabinet war rooms and accepted its broad premise, though he continued pressing for opportunistic offensives in the Mediterranean. One such opportunity arose with the planning of Operation Gymnast, later expanded into Operation Torch, which Churchill argued would strike at the soft underbelly of the Axis. Roosevelt was not yet convinced, but both leaders agreed to establish joint planning cells for North Africa, laying foundations for the future amphibious landings. Simultaneously, Churchill dealt with domestic strains. Britain's food supplies were tightening due to U-boat losses and the collapse of shipping through the Far East. Rationing was expanded again. Additional cuts to meat and fats were introduced. Churchill supported the Ministry of Food's efforts to maintain morale, including the Dig for Victory campaign and the conversion of public gardens into allotments. He also approved the recruitment of tens of thousands of additional women into war industries, building upon the measures outlined in his December 10th Commons speech. These efforts increased Britain's munitions output through the early months of 1942, compensating for battlefield losses. Churchill's correspondence with Roosevelt continued almost daily through late January and February. They exchanged telegrams on convoy routes, aircraft production schedules, and the deteriorating situation in Burma. Churchill repeatedly warned that a total collapse in the region would endanger India. Roosevelt responded by deploying Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell to coordinate American operations in the China-Burma-India theater, strengthening Allied ability to resist Japan's advance. Meanwhile, American engineers began planning new airfields across Bengal to support the future bombing campaign against Japan. In North America, Roosevelt moved swiftly to fulfill commitments made during Churchill's visit. The U.S. Navy expanded shipyard operations in Norfolk and Philadelphia, while the Army began constructing vast new camps to house incoming American troops destined for Britain. Production lines for Liberty ships were accelerated, with emergency contracts signed to build hundreds of vessels capable of replacing wartime losses. British officials visiting American factories reported astonishment at the scale of U.S. industrial capability. Detroit alone was producing aircraft engines at rates Britain had never achieved. Churchill, reading these reports, felt growing confidence that American industry would eventually dwarf Axis production by several orders of magnitude. By March 1942, the first large contingents of American troops were arriving in Britain. They marched through British ports wearing new equipment and carrying the latest M1 rifles, generating excitement among civilians who saw the long-awaited reinforcements as tangible proof that the United States had fully joined the fight. Churchill visited several of these units, delivering brief remarks and observing joint training exercises in the English countryside. The integration of American and British forces, begun during his Washington visit, was now moving rapidly from planning rooms to drill fields. Through these months, Churchill faced no illusions about the hardships ahead. Singapore had fallen, Burma was crumbling, and U-boats roamed the Atlantic with aggressive precision. Yet the foundations laid during his intense engagement with Roosevelt, combined command structures, integrated production, shared intelligence and coordinated deployments, were already beginning to shape the global course of the war. For Churchill, the winter of 1941–42 had transformed the geopolitical landscape. Britain was no longer fighting alone. A vast alliance was assembling, connected by strategy, shared resources, and relentless transatlantic communication. This new structure would soon carry the Allies into a series of campaigns that would ultimately reverse the Axis momentum on every front.